I woke up not knowing where I was. That's the part that stays with me, even now. The ceiling was white, the lights too bright, and for a moment I couldn't remember my own name. Then I heard my son's voice, cracked and low, saying, "Mom, I'm here, I'm right here." And I turned my head and saw his face, and I knew from the way he was looking at me, jaw set, eyes red, that whatever had happened, he already knew. I'm 63 years old. I was a librarian for 31 years at the main branch in Guelph, Ontario. I have 2 adult children, 4 grandchildren, a vegetable garden I'm very proud of, and a shelf of mysteries I've been meaning to get through since I retired. By every measure anyone could see from the outside, my life was good. More than good, settled, comfortable. The kind of life that makes people at church say, "You and Lionel, you've got it figured out, haven't you?" And I would smile and say something modest, and I would believe for a moment that they were right. That was the worst part of all of it, honestly. The believing. I need to go back to the beginning, because if I don't explain how I got there, none of the rest of it makes any sense. I know what some of you are already thinking. 63 years old, a grown woman, a retired professional, someone who spent her career helping other people find information. How does someone like that end up in an emergency room with a fractured wrist, a concussion, and bruising the attending physician would later describe, very carefully, as being in various stages of healing? I've asked myself that same question more times than I can count. The answer isn't simple, and I'm not going to pretend it is. Lionel and I met at a Canada Day barbecue in 1985. I was 24 and he was 28, and he had this laugh, big, unguarded, the kind that makes everyone in a room look over. He was a contractor, good with his hands, reliable, the sort of man who showed up when he said he would. My father liked him immediately. My mother asked if he went to church, and when Lionel said yes, she essentially started planning the wedding on the spot. We married in the spring of 1987 in a small ceremony in Fergus. My dress was ivory, the lilacs were just coming in, everything was exactly the way I'd imagined it. For a long time, a very long time, things were genuinely fine. We raised our children in a house on a quiet street, went to the same neighbors' Christmas parties for 20 years, took a trip to Prince Edward Island every other summer. We argued the way all couples argue about money and in-laws and whose turn it was to deal with the car insurance. Nothing that felt dangerous, nothing I would have called a warning. The shift happened slowly enough that I didn't notice it happening. Looking back, I can see that retirement was the match. Lionel retired in 2019 when his knees got bad enough that he couldn't be on site anymore. I retired the following spring, earlier than I'd planned, because his anxiety about being alone in the house all day had become its own kind of pressure. We were suddenly together 24 hours a day in a house that had always felt spacious, but now somehow seemed very small. At first it was just irritability. Short answers, a sharpness in his voice when I asked simple questions. I chalked it up to the adjustment. Retirement is hard for men who define themselves entirely by their work. I'd read about that, actually, in one of the books I'd shelved dozens of times over the years. I was patient, I made allowances. Then one evening in October of 2020, I forgot to take the pork chops out of the freezer in time for supper. I'd been on the phone with my daughter-in-law about the baby, and the time had slipped away from me. I told Lionel I'd make something else. There was plenty in the pantry. It wasn't a problem. He picked up the frozen package from the counter and threw it at me. It caught my shoulder. I stood there completely still for what felt like a very long time, staring at the chops on the linoleum. "This is what you do," he said. "You putter around all day and you can't manage one simple thing." I didn't say anything. I bent down and picked up the package and put it in the sink to thaw. I made pasta instead and we ate in silence, and I told myself it was stress, that it was the isolation of the pandemic, that every marriage goes through rough patches, and this was ours, that the man I'd known for 35 years was still in there somewhere. He apologized the next morning. He'd gone out to Tim Hortons and come back with my coffee exactly how I like it. Double, and a box of Timbits, which he set on the table and said, I was out of line. He didn't look me in the eye when he said it, but I accepted it. I wanted to accept it. 3 weeks later, he slapped me across the face for leaving the porch light on overnight. I'm not going to walk you through every incident in sequence, because the middle years blur together in a way that I think is its own kind of damage. What I can tell you is that it escalated faster than I ever could have predicted, and it was far more calculated than it looked from the inside. He hurt me in places that didn't show. He learned quickly what I could cover with a cardigan or explain with a stumble on the ice. He knew I was proud. He knew I would sooner die than tell my children. He was right about that for a very long time. He took over the finances completely in the second year. He had always managed the investments. That had been an arrangement from early in our marriage that I hadn't thought twice about. But now he moved things so that my CPP came into a joint account he controlled entirely. And when I asked about the RRSP, he said he'd consolidated everything and I should just tell him what I needed. He gave me an allowance, cash, weekly. He kept the receipts from the grocery store. He told me that at our age we needed to be careful, that he was protecting us, that I'd always been too careless with money. I was a librarian. I'd managed a program budget of $40,000 a year for the better part of a decade. But somehow, inside those walls, I believed him. He isolated me from my friends one cancellation at a time. Coffee with a colleague from the library? He'd start a fight the night before so I'd be too ashamed to sit across from someone over a muffin with a swollen jaw. My book club? He'd complain that I cared more about a bunch of women talking about fiction than I did about my own husband. Eventually, I stopped being invited places because I'd said no too many times. Eventually, I stopped expecting the invitations. My children were the hardest part. My son and daughter-in-law lived 40 minutes away in Cambridge, and they had 2 small children and full lives, and it wasn't difficult to keep them at arm's length. I was the one who made excuses. I was the one who canceled Sunday dinners and said I wasn't feeling well. Lionel would stand in the hallway listening while I spoke to my son on the phone, and I'd chat about the grandchildren and the weather and whatever was on the news, and I'd pretend everything was perfectly ordinary. My son would sometimes say, "You seem tired, Mum," and I'd say, "Oh, just the season," and we'd hang up, and I'd stand there in the hallway alone with the phone in my hand, listening to the silence of my own house. There was a night in the 3rd year when I decided I had to leave. I'd packed a small bag and put it under the bed in the spare room. I'd looked up the address of a women's shelter in Guelph on a library computer. I didn't dare use our home computer or my phone because I knew he checked both. For approximately 16 hours, I had a plan. He found the bag. I still don't know how. He came into the kitchen one morning while I was washing up, set the bag on the table between us, and looked at me without saying a single word for what felt like a full minute. Then he told me, very quietly, that if I ever tried to leave, he would tell my children that I had a drinking problem and had been hiding it for years. He said he had documentation. I had no idea what that meant, and I was too frightened to ask. I put the bag away. After that, I stopped thinking about escape. I just lived day to day in the smallest possible way, trying to anticipate his moods, trying to keep the peace, trying not to exist too loudly in my own home. I became very good at reading the weather of him. The way his shoulders sat when he came in from outside, whether he'd pour a drink before he even took off his coat. I could tell within 30 seconds of him walking through the door what the evening was going to be. I had stopped seeing any of this as abnormal. It had become the texture of my life. It was a Sunday in March. We'd had a mild snap and the snow was turning to gray slush, and the backyard looked a sorry state. Lionel had been in a black mood all day because a hockey game had gone badly. I'd learned to make myself invisible during games, but I'd made the mistake of walking through the room to get a glass of water, and he'd seen me, and for some reason, that was enough. I won't describe the next part in detail. I'll just tell you that I ended up at the bottom of the stairs. I remember the first 2 steps, and then I don't remember anything until I was already in the ambulance, which I didn't fully understand until much later, because I thought I was dreaming. What I learned afterward was this. Lionel had called 911. He told the dispatcher that his wife had slipped on the stairs, that she was unconscious. He rode with me in the ambulance. He told the paramedics the same story, and he told it convincingly because he'd had years of practice constructing the narrative that explained me away. What he didn't anticipate was my son. My son had been trying to reach me all morning. We'd made loose plans to bring the grandchildren over, and when I didn't pick up, he started to worry in the particular way children worry about their older parents. He got in the car and drove from Cambridge to Guelph on instinct. He arrived at the hospital 17 minutes after I did because the ambulance had passed him on Speedvale Avenue, and something in his gut told him to follow it. He found Lionel in the waiting area of the ER at Guelph General. Lionel's story, very smooth, very rehearsed, apparently stopped my son cold. He told me later he couldn't say exactly what it was. Something in the delivery. Something too prepared, like lines someone had memorized rather than words that had just happened. He didn't say anything to Lionel. He went straight to the nurse's station and asked to speak to whoever was treating me. Meanwhile, in the examination room, I was coming in and out. There was a doctor, methodical, unhurried, with a manner that I found steadying even through the confusion, who was asking me questions I could barely form answers to. And there was a nurse who kept her hand on my forearm in a way I can only describe as deliberate, not clinical, deliberate, like a message. She was the one who closed the curtain all the way. She said in a very low voice, "I want you to know that we're going to take excellent care of you. And I want to tell you that I've been a nurse for 22 years, and what I'm seeing on your body didn't come from one fall." I turned my head away from her. I couldn't look at her when she said it. "Your son is here," she said. "He's asking to see you." Something cracked open in me when she said that. I don't know how else to describe it. Like ice in April. Like something that had been locked for a very long time giving way all at once. The doctor came back in and he was direct with me. He showed me the preliminary findings from the imaging. A concussion, a fractured wrist. He said the angle of the fracture wasn't consistent with how a person instinctively catches themselves in a fall. And then he said, carefully, "I'm also seeing older injuries. A healed rib fracture, bruising in multiple stages of resolution." He paused. "These findings create a picture, and that picture concerns me a great deal." I heard Lionel's voice from somewhere beyond the curtain, insisting that he should be allowed in, that he was my husband, that this was unnecessary. The doctor stepped out. I heard him tell Lionel, very politely, that the patient needed quiet and that he would be updated when there was something to update. He said it in a way that left no room for argument. Then my son came in. He took one look at me and made a sound I never want to hear from one of my children again as long as I live. He sat down beside the bed and took my hand, the one without the brace, and he said, "Mom, tell me the truth." I had kept this secret for 4 years. I had swallowed it down every single day until it had become part of me, a stone I carried so constantly I'd stopped feeling the weight of it. I had protected Lionel, and I had protected my children from the knowledge of what my life had become, and I had protected my own pride because at 60 years old the humiliation of this truth was almost more than I could hold. I held my son's hand and I said, "It wasn't the stairs." That was all I said. And my son nodded, very slowly, and then he leaned forward and rested his forehead against the back of my hand and stayed there without speaking for a long moment. When he straightened up, his face was different. Something had locked into place behind his eyes. He called the nurse back in and said that I had something I wanted to tell the doctor. I told them everything, not all at once, and not without stopping, and not without the nurse quietly passing me tissues while my son kept his hand over mine. I told them about the 4 years, the progression, the financial control, the isolation, the bag I'd packed and then put away, the threats. What I didn't know until later was that my son had been quietly, separately gathering courage for months. He'd noticed my wrist at Thanksgiving, the way I kept it turned from people, the way I flinched when his youngest bumped into me. He'd made a note in his phone that same evening, just a single line, "Mum's wrist," the way she held it. Ask again later. He'd been trying to find the right moment to ask. He'd run out of time before he managed it. That note, combined with photographs he'd taken of what my wrist looked like at Thanksgiving, combined with my statement and the medical records. The officer who came to take my statement called it significant. She was calm and unhurried, and when I hesitated, she simply waited. She didn't ask me why I'd stayed. Not once. Lionel was still in the waiting room when the officers found him, still playing the worried husband, still telling anyone nearby about the icy stairs and my tendency to rush. It didn't hold. He was taken in for questioning that same evening. He was charged the following morning. I stayed in hospital for 2 nights. My daughter-in-law drove up from Cambridge and slept in the chair beside my bed and brought me decent tea from the Tim Hortons downstairs because she knew I couldn't manage the hospital version. My son went to the house and collected what I needed. He wouldn't let me come back there. I didn't argue. I stayed with them in Cambridge for the first 2 months. I spent a lot of time sitting in their backyard watching the spring arrive, and I cried more than I had cried in years. There is something about real safety, the genuine article, that finally gives grief the room it needs. All the tears I hadn't been able to cry for 4 years came up at once when there was nowhere for them to go but out. I started seeing a counselor through the Victim Services program connected to the hospital. She specialized in trauma in older adults. In our first session, she said something I've thought about nearly every day since. She said, "Many people assume that what you've described should be easier to leave than abuse earlier in life. In fact, it is often considerably harder. You had a shared history, shared finances, a shared identity built over decades. Leaving meant dismantling an entire life." She said it plainly, as a fact, without any softness around it that might have felt like pity. It was the first time I had sat with someone and not felt stupid for having stayed. The legal process took most of a year. The Crown Attorney's Office took the case seriously. Victim Services connected me with Legal Aid Ontario and a duty counsel process that I would never have navigated alone. I gave a videotaped statement and later testified in court, which was one of the hardest things I have ever done. Lionel hired a lawyer who suggested my memory was compromised by the concussion, that I was confused about the timeline, that the older injuries were consistent with the arthritis I'd been treated for in my hands. I am 63 years old, and I have been reading and thinking carefully my entire adult life. I told the court exactly what had happened and exactly when, and I looked at the wall just to the left of Lionel's head while I did it so that I didn't have to see his face. He was convicted on 2 counts of assault, causing bodily harm, and 1 count of criminal harassment. He was sentenced to 22 months in a provincial facility and 3 years of probation, with a lifetime firearms prohibition and a permanent no-contact order. When the sentence was read, I felt, for a moment, nothing. Just white space, very still. And then I felt my son's hand on my shoulder, and my daughter-in-law's hand close around mine, and something warm moved through me that I can only call relief. That was 14 months ago. I live now in a rented flat in a part of Guelph I'd always liked but never quite gotten to. A few minutes walk from the river trail, close enough to a farmer's market that I go every Saturday morning. It's a 2-bedroom, which is more than I need, but I wanted the second room for when the grandchildren visit, and they do visit. They come on weekends and make an absolute disaster of the kitchen, and I love every minute of it. The financial recovery has been its own kind of work. Victim Services connected me with a financial advisor through a women's resource center, and understanding what 4 years of Lionel's control had done to my CPP and the RRSPs has taken patience. But it's being done. It's getting sorted. My name is back on my own accounts. I know what I have. I still have bad nights. I still sometimes wake and lie very still, listening to the building. Old habits that don't let go easily. My counselor says this is normal, that the nervous system learns vigilance, and it takes time to teach it that the threat is truly gone. I am patient with myself about that. I'm trying to be. What I want to say to you, and I mean this particularly for anyone watching who is older, who thinks their situation doesn't fit the picture people usually have when they talk about this, is that age doesn't protect you, and age doesn't disqualify you from help. There is no point in a marriage after which harm becomes acceptable or after which leaving becomes impossible. I was 63 years old in that hospital bed. I am 64 now, living alone for the first time in my adult life. I am growing tomatoes again in pots on my balcony. I am working through that shelf of mysteries. I am, genuinely, not as a performance, all right. My son asks me sometimes why I didn't tell him. And I tell him the truth, which is that I was trying to protect him, and that I was ashamed, and that by the time it was bad enough to warrant telling, I had been conditioned to believe no one would believe me. A 63-year-old grandmother, a retired librarian, a woman who'd been in the same marriage for 35 years. Who was going to take that seriously? The nurse in that ER took it seriously. The doctor took it seriously. My son, who drove to Guelph on a Sunday morning in March on nothing but instinct, took it seriously. If you are in Canada and you need to talk to someone, the Assaulted Women's Helpline in Ontario is 1-866-863-0511. It is free, confidential, and available around the clock. There are equivalent lines in every province. The people who answer will not ask you why you stayed. They will ask you what you need. You can tell someone, "You can survive this. I did, and I am not remarkable. I am just still here." And some mornings, when the light comes through the kitchen window at the right angle and the river trail is quiet, and the market has peaches that smell exactly the way peaches are supposed to smell, still being here feels like more than enough.